What if the biggest mistake most students and new entrepreneurs make is thinking innovation is just a new idea? Today on Unbarred Conversations, I'm sitting down with Michael Kerr, former executive director at Alberta Innovates with decades of experience funding and advising real innovation. We cut through the fluff on why novelty alone isn't enough, how to turn creativity into something the market will actually buy and society will benefit from, the power of early customer engagement, and why you should expect 40 plus iterations before you get it right. If you're a business student or a young professional who wants honest feedback on innovation, creativity, critical thinking, and turning ideas into real value, this conversation delivers. Let's get into it.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here. I'm father of four, and actually, I'm a grandparent of six now. So that's my motivation on the family side is the little ones are a treasure and want to be closer to them, hence spend a little more time with them, and that's why I'm moving into that. I'll call it semi-retirement over retirement because I am still around. But my background in technology is I do actually have a degree in chemistry that I got from Simon Fraser University. And I actually did my Master's of Business Administration at Athabasca back when it was online programs was just a new thing. So I'll age myself a bit there. But in terms of my career, I've worked for a small startup company in forestry in their labs through to a Fortune 500 company. So as the plant chemist for FMC that was doing hydrogen peroxide, which was used for paper bleaching. And then I spent 28 years in government in innovation. So both National Research Council, I was 14 years there and 13 years with Alberta Innovates, primarily in the funding support of bringing innovation to life or to the marketplace. So that was basically my swim lane there is how to support those companies, both in funding and advisory service.
We spent a fair amount of time together with talking to my teams in a lot of cases. A lot of them were JDC West teams, and often it was the entrepreneurship team. I think was a question of a lot of those team members was this idea of what is innovation? What is creativity? Maybe talk about that a little bit in terms of this idea of innovation versus creativity, and how do you take creativity and turn it into something that is innovation?
It's a great question and it's multifaceted. So I'll just break that down. So within the context of the world I was in, National Research Council, I was with them in northern British Columbia, which is an important thing to note in terms of being more regional. And then my role within Alberta Innovates in the same vein was not only across the province, but primarily in the Calgary region, so bigger center. Now, with innovation, when I dig into it, is traditionally we think of it as something new, something novel, something that has patentable creation that is protectable. And that also can then be commercialized. So that's the second thing, part of innovation. So it's not only something new or novel, but it's something that creates the value that the market would look at. But I am going to back that up just a bit because my career has evolved, and especially in the northern BC context, where you get a lot more into what they call social innovation. The value is a benefit to the society, not necessarily an economic value. We do need to be careful of novelty or innovation having both a social novelty as well as, if you are in business, a profit-centered value proposition there. But I also will say within the Alberta Innovates context too, is novelty didn't need to be that new patented whatever. It could be using known things in a new way to increase value. And so some of that innovation that I've been involved with most recently in my Alberta Innovates career as executive director of advanced hydrocarbon, we were looking for novelty of byproducts of oil and gas. And probably the biggest one we're going to hear about over the next bit is how do we take that byproduct, the thicker, heavier oil, and get some value out of it versus the combustion route itself. So there's a lot happening there with using it for advanced manufacturing and advanced materials, which can go beyond just an oil and gas, but into new areas that traditionally oil and gas you wouldn't have thought of as a manufacturing product versus a combustion product.
Discussion with the students on was this idea of value. And so, what does that actually mean? And it's really interesting that you mentioned social value because I also coached a number of not for profit cases, the big one being in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown. I think one of the big things is that transformation from what people thought of as traditional not for profit into this more of this idea of social profit. Maybe talk about what you see as that value piece.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. Is changing the mindset because so often we've thought of not for profits as can't have profit and is not sustainable, that it has those organizations will have their hand out every year when government grants are coming out or for donations, especially as we're coming up to the December timeframe and everybody's pushing to get their charitable donations in time. But changing that mindset, and I am on a few not-for-profit boards right now, and especially in my semi-retirement mode, I'm taking a bit of that stance of how do we use some of that donation money to make it sustainable so it's not a handout every year just to keep the organization going? So we can even think of things such as food security, so food banks. So how do we build that with community gardens or community kitchens to move forward on the social side? And when you change that mindset of, okay, now it's not just a handout to the people that you're serving, it's actually sustainable itself, and you're creating this social network and social framework that then helps build and encourages their mental health and move forward. So, as I say, it's a slightly different twist on what we would know from a business perspective of get your grant money or get your initial revenues to keep it sustaining and profits, and then you don't need it anymore because profits sustain it. So it's the same mentality there.
That's really interesting. And I think it's been, I think, a big focus of where I've coached a lot of teams, especially in the last probably 5 to 6 years. And I think that's showing because we've actually been, as a school, we were really successful in Georgetown. I don't think we missed the finals in the last 5 or 6 years. And part of it was just taking that whole idea that, yeah, let's reframe this. And I think that sustainability part of it is really important in terms of the value, especially on the not-for-profit, and this whole idea around this concept of social profit rather than let's kind of take donations and see what we can do with them and see if we're still around next year type of idea. So I think that's key. With that, I think the other piece of it is when we start to look at this whole idea of innovation, I think students really struggle with, and I think it's both on the profit and not for profit side of it, is how do they take that idea that they think is innovative or novel and start to apply pieces to it that turn it into something that is actionable. And I think, again, big thing with entrepreneurs too, in terms of how do we take this thing, this invention or whatever the heck it is, and turn it into something that they can make actionable. And I think that's where you were really valuable to the teams. And I think that was a big part of what you did at Alberta Innovates in a lot of cases in the discussions we've had together.
So jumping on that, I would just do the frame of reference around this is years of being side by side with companies that I would be funding both for when I was with the federal government and the provincial government. So it's experiential learning, shall we say, as we move forward. But I'd say the biggest takeaways, if I was to extol that into students and or those that are starting a company, is the understanding your marketplace. So who is that market? Whether it's social and or an innovative business in the high tech sector. How do you engage your clients and your customers as early as possible to really understand what the pain is that what you're offering will solve and what will the market pay for that solution? And so you get that input. Now, so many companies would be scared and say, well, giving up my secret sauce then. And the answer is you don't have to go that far. You can have a conversation and have the general gist of what it is or what the pain you're going to solve from the marketplace. Those of you who know the business model canvas, you can sketch that out using a business model canvas, sufficient to have a discussion of what's the pain without releasing anything. And then you can get that back and forth and refine it. And then the next piece is come up with a prototype, bare bones prototype as early as possible and test it before you do the full launch. Too many companies or organizations I ran into were like, we're putting $1 million into, pieces of equipment and things, and you still haven't debugged what the innovation or the pain that will be solved. So spend as little as possible to move forward. And so with that, we will call it Deming was a good guy with the plan, do, study, act cycle. So you do several iterations of plan, do, study, act and move forward until you get it right. What I teach at Mount Royal University in innovation, I remind them of WD-40 is named water displacement 40. And that was because it was about water displacement and it took 40 iterations before they got it right. So expect 40, maybe more iterations in there. And how do you do that? The best way to do it is engage the market, keep doing those plan, do, study, act cycles to move forward. And before you actually release into the market, I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. And along that line, so you and I have coached many companies along the way, is also understanding the difference between sales and marketing. And you can get a lot of good marketing information that says this is going to work. That's great, but it's still not a sale. And so you might not have that engagement yet, although all your marketing information says it should go, and it doesn't. And sometimes there's this shock, but understanding the difference that sales is different than marketing. And your marketing can say this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but the sales don't come. And you're really digging into that again, that cycle and engagement of the client before you spend a lot of money or go for a grant. Because when I was on the granting side, I would turn down many where you go, yeah, nice idea, but if you can't convince me that you've actually got clients that are ready and there at least for a demo, it's too risky.
That's really interesting. I think again, those are things we've talked about a fair amount. I'm wondering just in terms of, and word you mentioned a lot was engagement and engaging the customer. And how do you, as you talk to entrepreneurs that have this idea, that have this marketing material, what do you talk to them about in terms of getting that engagement going, and what is the, I guess, the plan part of the engagement section of this? Because I think you're right. It's about, if you're not making sales, it's not going anywhere and you're not going to get any value out of it, right? In terms of your side, and you're not delivering value to the customer side. So I think there's also that little bit of equation of engagement to value type of thing. So maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And it's funny you bring that up because I would tell clients, many companies, is there's engagement and there's engagement. And there's the two different types. The first engagement is, and you see this a lot with especially larger companies or government agencies. You get the letter, the nondescript letter of, yeah, we're behind you. And that is the worst kind of engagement that you can get because it's like, we're happy as long as you're spending your time and money on it. But if you get something, please help us to be the first second, we call it. And the first second being, once you've debugged it and risk freed it, we want to be your first client. Happy as long as you keep spending government money in yours. The other type of engagement is the one where you would see a company say, yeah, we've got a problem. We'd love to have you tested on our site. And we're going to put some resources, whether it's people or equipment, behind it. And that's the side by side engagement. So if I saw those types of engagements, then you go, okay, we're off to the races here. We've got something. But if you had the first one, you're going, it's not really there. And you'd want to dig into a little more of well, what is it? We're asking too big a client. So the big oil and gas companies, they're not traditionally going to be your first ones to get into the risky innovation space. Generally, they'll keep that to themselves. But the juniors or other companies, you certainly would see that in a traditional model. And so they would get engaged and you'd start to de-risk that way in terms of moving forward. And you look at, well, what are the measures that we're going to get to in terms of a demonstration? What do you need us to target to hit? And I find if you ask that, then at least now you're getting some information of what resonates with them. Is it increased production, decreased costs, and how much do we need to get in there? That helps us with the demonstration as well as the iteration. That one of those cycles of plan, do, study, act is, can we actually make what it is that they're after with the features that they want? The next thing, equally important. So that's the technical side, which many companies would get involved with. But on the business side, I would always coach and say, go in and ask the company, tell me about your procurement cycle and your strategic plan. And then stop talking and just listen and take lots of notes, because there you're going to understand who makes the decision. And on the strategy side, what's important? What is resonating today? Is it reduced greenhouse gases because there's pressure from the government to reduce that? Well, maybe. Is it foreign competition and they're now more price competitive than we are? What is it that's there? And on the procurement side, we also want to know, what is the cycle? When is the best time to ask for something to put forward? What's the price constraints? And also, what are the signing authorities for various tests? Because what you might find in big industry, at least when I was in big industry, there were cutoffs at certain levels. So you'd find that a demo of less than $50,000 only required that the department head to sign it off. Okay, that's my target, right? So those are the things that we quite often miss when we're trying to get those pieces forward. If that helps for some of your students.
Yeah, no, I think that is a helpful piece. I think the other, and I think you mentioned one of the ones in there was competition. And that's always been interesting. Running the mountain bike tour company that I did, I quite often talk to other people trying to get into the tourism industry. But I think it also happens a lot with my students in that when they think of competition, they get a real local type of focus. They're looking at who's their competitor next door. And I always go through this thing that, you know what, especially in tourism, you're competing with the world. Because first of all, you have to convince them to come to Canada. Then you have to convince them to come to Alberta. And the last person I talked to on this was in Fernie. And then you have to convince them to Fernie and then look at all the things that are in Fernie and convince them. So maybe just some types of things that as you're talking to your clients, what do you talk about when it comes to really considering what does that competitive map really look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've touched on many, but I think the biggest one that I have seen companies miss is the status quo. And so what are they doing now? And just because you have the solution to a problem and maybe you do have the only solution to the problem, still that doesn't guarantee a sale. People are still content with doing whatever it is they're doing today. And sometimes I find that inertia competition is harder than any amount of other company competition. It's how do you get people to really gravitate to that innovation that you're putting forward. So that's the first one. Second one is uh, many new companies forget that they're high risk. So if you're a larger company and you're putting a significant amount of money forward, and as well as, especially in the AI space, your data at risk, how do I know that that company is going to last even a year? So that you have to get over that as a competition as well. Is it's a lot easier to just go and get, Google or Amazon or something that's a big reputable name. You know they're going to be around at least for another year or so compared to what you and I might put forward as a company. So that is competition on top of your price, your product, and all those other competitive marketing intelligence that you're putting forward as well. So those are ones that I would say really keep a view in there. Can you partner with somebody to take that edge off? Can you do what we call white label? So that is you're a part of something bigger that now actually works in a coordinated fashion to help bring it to market. I would say demo, so that's another way is if you can get a demo or a trial, it quite often takes the edge off. But again, caution is demos can go on forever. So at some point, you have to say to the client, and sometimes it's been a hard conversation of, okay, you're stringing us along here with demos enough. Are you actually ever going to buy, or are you just waiting us out until we get tired and run out of cash flow before we go that way? So as I say, those are the things I would really look at for competition. And then piece, be very honest of what does your true competitors, what do they do well? When I would get a grant application and all they do is slag the competition, say they are no good. Well, they're good enough because they're making some money, so they're obviously doing something right. So what is that, and how do we take that into context of being fair to the competition such that you're appealing to the client base?
Yeah, no, I think he hit some really important points there that often, as I say, especially with student groups, that really get ignored in a lot of cases and don't come forward in terms of their thinking when they're thinking about their solution, especially when they're rushed in time and they've got a short resolution period like a JDC West or something like that. And it was really interesting because I had worked with Larry Wood at the Haskane School as a co-coach for one of the MBA teams, and him and a couple of people in the past had developed a little bit of a tool. So at that competition, they're able to put up these great big sheets of paper and start to take notes and stuff. They really organized it in terms of 11 charts. And so those 11 charts had, I think, 12 questions, really. And I took a look at it and it's like, I'm hearing these teams say this, but what they're missing is they're missing a whole bunch of pieces of the answer to this question. And the big one was quite often procurement, last mile delivery, all of those type of things. So what I did was take those big 12 questions and break them down into, let's start to think about those components. And I had a really good suggestion in the case course I taught this past August during a 5-day intensive course from a student saying that the Word document was really good and it got him to think about a lot of stuff. How do we turn this into a tool that teams could actually use a little better? So we talked about it and we created this Excel tool that we're going back and forth on and getting his opinion on, and then I'll get other students to test it, etc. So that's really work. But I think what often happens is there's a lot of things missed when people are thinking about things. And I think he covered off a number of those types of things. So that's really good. I think
Yeah,
the
if
one,
I could, can I just
yeah, go
jump
ahead.
on that up? Because you're bringing up a very interesting learning that I've seen as well. And well, actually, a couple. So the first is case competitions are different than selling to a client. And although, yeah, the context is still there, I have found, but not just student case competitions, but I've seen pitch contests of companies pitching to venture capital, and they're very good at it, but they still fail as a business. And they're scratching their head of what happened. And so being able to pitch a brilliant idea or an innovation is just part of the equation. So it really is, yeah, we think your idea has merit, but the call to action is different than when you're moving it to marketplace. So I find some that are really good at case competitions are shocked of why didn't it work? Why didn't I end up with $1 million of sales and venture capital money? And the reason I say that is it's different because the call to action is different. Because I can be a judge on a panel and go, brilliant idea. That sounds really cool. I'm behind you 100%, but it's risky. Sure. That's different than asking me in the call to action to pull out my wallet and say, you actually want me to implement it? And it's funny, but the mindset is different there. And I do find that it is quite different. And I would say in a call to action for a case competition is vote for me versus if I'm pitching to you to sell to you is, okay, well, what do I need to prove to you as a demo, or what do I need to prove to you before you will pull out the checkbook? And so the technique I use there is I say, put it in writing, have the conversation, and then send the note back to them as, okay, I understand that if we hit this target, that target, and the other target, that you would be purchasing 2 units, 5 units, whatever that would be, or a monthly subscription. And as soon as you start to do that, now you're locking them in. And that's the difference again between actually doing the business and a case competition. And yeah, you want to make sure that those are different.
I totally agree with that. And I think over the years, and especially in probably the last decade or so, in terms of the coaching piece really became more about, it's not the end result. It's not what they said. Like you can say, yeah, and it is vote for me as the actual piece of it. But really, the value on the student side of it is really about, can I gain some skills? Can I learn how to communicate better? Can I learn to put a message together and those things? Can I work together as a team? In fact, and I don't think I ever told you this, and the reason you always got invited later on in the process was, for the first part of the process, I didn't really care what my students came up with. The ideas didn't matter. A little bit of the structure piece mattered a bit, but I had to come up with some questions so we could replicate this Q&A thing. Sometimes that was really difficult early on, but the discussions when we got together as teams was, how are you working together, rather than, this is what I saw in terms of the presentation. And we brought in people like yourself, et cetera, to help them with the content and the knowledge piece of it. So I think that was important. But what I had in mind as you're talking about the competition thing too was, I volunteer for the Heat Network at Haskayne, which is advising in ideation and pitches for their 2 introductory entrepreneurship course, the one for non-faculty students and the one for faculty students. And I'm actually doing one this afternoon, and it's their pitch competition, their pitch, and so giving them feedback. But the ideation one I haven't done as much, but I've done that actually a couple. Actually, I think I did 3 different classes this year, and I did some in the spring too. And it's really interesting that they really restrict themselves in terms of the idea. And I think going back to that competition thing is, it's always about, we're going to make this happen. And there's no thought about partnerships or things like licensing or selling off the idea, et cetera. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit more in detail, because I thought that was an interesting piece. And it's a piece that I think a lot of students, and I think a lot of social entrepreneurs, doesn't enter their mind, that it doesn't have to be all me, right? There's other there's other ways to do this.
You're touching on a couple things, so appreciate you bringing it up. So the first one that resonates is the team itself. So understanding the balance of the team, and that's case competition as well as in companies. And it's fascinating to see how many don't have a balanced team. So they're either all tech people or they're all business people, when they don't have that balance. So I'd say be okay to have on your team or hire on your team those that are different than yourself, especially in the early stage. So the teams, as I say, JDC West, the ones that did well were that balance of the business technology or that more creative person who could really spin a nice story and really motivate people, alongside the person who was the data fact based person that, and you really needed that. Well, same thing goes across on both sides of that equation. But the other piece you bring up, which is also very interesting, and I've seen this trend, and it's a little distressing from what I saw from the government side, was too many companies and even pitch contests are so stuck right now on the big venture capital raise that they think valuation is validation. And in some cases it is, But in most cases I see, especially on the earlier ones, is they're chasing valuation, which is an artificial number before they've even had a sale. So as they stick more on the validation of the market, those those first sales give you more validation and valuation than any amount of venture capital putting money to something, because that's only limited cash flow that you can burn through, and still you may not get a sale just because a VC likes it. Yes, that's good, but doesn't in itself get us where we need to go.
Yeah, and I think, and it's something that I comment to teams and students all the time in terms of this whole idea of valuation. I just wrote a case on the WNBA that I used in the case course, and we'll see where it goes with that. But it was really interesting to me with their upstart rival with Unrivaled, and the news coming out in October or September, something like that. They had new investors, etc. And this valuation of $340 million. What does that actually mean? Like, this league is not getting things like television ratings that it probably should be to attract advertisers. They've got limited spectators. Yeah, they've got a fair amount of social media stats to go with them. But is this sustainable? Like, yeah, so you evaluated at $340 million, but is it going to be around 2 or 3 years from now when their broadcaster, who's a major partner, is not getting the television ratings, we're not getting the advertising revenue? Or worst off, their broadcaster is potentially up for sale to a company that potentially won't support this type of activity. Right. So I think that's a hugely interesting piece, and maybe a good way to hop over to the other piece of this, and the question around how do you support the launch of the ideas, and talking about, what I think when we had those sessions and I brought the team up to Alberta Innovates and we talked, about half the session was really about financial support, what those essential factors were to get the idea off the ground. And maybe we could talk about that a little bit for the next bit.
Yeah. So again, it goes back to that initial piece of what is that first call to action, that validation. And it's funny, as a former government person looking at it, is what is that first step? And it didn't need to be selling to the biggest company or anything. That didn't impress. What did impress, if you have even a small company that has their checkbook open and ready to move forward. The second piece in terms of that conversation, and it was funny, is when I would first talk to any company, I'd want to know, what is your next call to action? What is the next small step? Is it that piece that's there? But I'd also ask them, what is success? And I'd frame it in the regard of, if I was to meet you, or you and I were to sit down 3 to 5 years from now, and you said, we were so successful, what is that? And I would say a very, very small percentage of companies could actually answer that question. They were only thinking in that short term goal of, yeah, we're going to get our idea out, we're going to get the big VC raise, but not understanding it in 5 years. And even if it is, we're going to sell our company. Great. Okay. So what do we need to do today to line up to help you maximize the value so that you're going to get the best sale? Or who are we selling to as a company as a whole? So the company side strategy moving forward. The other piece would be, all right, so who are the clients side of it, which is different. So you're operating on the company, but you're also operating on in the company in terms of what is the sales cycle and moving forward. So who are our clients today, and what are we solving that moves and advances the needle for that bigger strategy to move forward? And I see it so often is, they don't understand what it is that success is. So go think about it, and there is no wrong answer. Just tell me where we're at, because otherwise we're not supporting you in the right direction. So your journey's going like jello all over the place, and it's not helping, but I can support you more if I know what our targets are to bring that narrative. And then the second piece, as I say, is the call to action, both in the short term and the long term. So whether it's a pitch or whether it's an actual you're in the company, is they've finished the pitch or they've finished the talk for the next innovation, but I don't know what the next step is. Do you need me to write a check? Do you want me to buy some? What is that? So be very, very clear. And I know you and I coached JDC West on the what is that call to action, really helped enhance move that forward. In terms of the clients and where to go first, is I would talk with many of the companies I work with in the first meetings, is understanding the call to action as it pertains to two things. The first piece is, where are you going with the company as a whole? So quite often the question I would ask in a first meeting of a company or innovative company is, if we're to down together 5 years from now and we were successful, what would that be? And no answer is really the wrong answer, but only a handful of companies in my entire career could actually answer that right off the get-go in a meaningful way. More often than not, it was, okay, we're not going to talk about your innovation per se, is let's talk about your business. Where are you going? Because if in 3 to 5 years you want to sell, that's a whole now set of activities we're going to do in the next 3 to 5 years to increase valuation, increase market share, to be appealing to, and we'll specify. So who would we buy to? Who would be buying us? And what are they buying? Put ourselves in their shoes and really understand that piece of it, because then that'll tell us, well, do we need to patent something today because that's the value that they're buying later? Or is it the market share because it's a nice add-on to what that purchaser will have? So that's the first piece. The second piece then is that call to action that is needed, that quite often is missing of, well, if I'm working in the business today, what are we selling? To whom? How do I get that sale? What are they buying? What's the stressor of our clients? And in some cases, it's the customer's customer. So if I'm selling to an oil and gas, junior oil and gas company, well, they have the client of the major oil and gas, perchance. So what are they trying to do right now? What's a stressor for them, and how do I do that call of action to move forward? Which, let's say, is different than if you're pitching or pitching to investors. So you have to know who's your market, where are you moving forward. But I always tell clients of mine is, make sure you finish every meeting with a call to action and who's doing what by when. Otherwise, you lose that momentum to move forward. The second piece there to the puzzle is around the team. And you have to be okay and comfortable in your discomfort of, I'm going to have a team member that is different than me. Are they better at the technology, the better at the business? Are they more on that creative sales side that can spin a yarn and close a sale? Or if they don't have that balance, you need to go find it quickly, because you need all those skill sets and they need to appreciate each other around the table versus competing and ripping each other apart. The best ones I ever invested with are those both JDC West teams as well as companies where they had that balance, and those traditionally were the more successful companies.
I encourage my teams to do this when, even in their case competitions or pitches, is to really talk about like this whole idea of what is success. And I think that's a hugely important piece of it. And I explore that a little bit further in terms of, how do you get them to think about what that success might be and put more of a long-term perspective on it. Because as we know, business, it's the next quarter, when, especially when you're looking at CEOs, et cetera, there's a lot of focus on those financial results for the next quarter, et cetera. And we want to impress the shareholder type of thing. And I think that gets transferred down to students, and they think the same way. And I think probably in terms of my experience with some of the entrepreneurs I've talked with, this on and more of an informal basis, I think the same thing kind of happens. So how do you encourage that, and how do you encourage it to get, I guess, a more long term outlook?
It's fascinating because I'm going to weave in because right now I'm teaching at the University of Northern BC their MBA program, a course. It's their capstone course called Strategic Implementation, which is exactly that. And it's fascinating that organizations build strategy and that they don't think about it until the next time they have to put their strategic plan together a year from now or 2 years from now. And it's just shelved. But what they forget is that what is the space from senior leadership, and even if it's a small company, may only have 4 people, but the distance from strategy development and strategy implementation is huge. And so one of the tools that is out there is the strategy map, which is part of the business model canvas. So there was a map there where you can actually show the areas from finance to market to operations where you're at. You put your key performance indicators of what it is we're trying to do. And then the last piece I like on there is, well, which projects do we do with a shorter term and a balance between a shorter term and longer term in order to hit those strategic goals as an organization. And so few companies do that. And what would always impress me are companies that say, this is our strategy, and here's the projects of why we're asking you for money and how that will help us move forward to implement our strategy versus yeah, we did our strategy thing last year. That's good. We'll open up again next year. And what's the relation there? And we laugh, but of the organizations I run into, it's maybe only a handful that would actually integrate that piece there. But I will just go back and extol the virtues of the strategy canvas, which is, you can look it up online, keeps that litmus test. Put it above your desk, behind your chair or whatever, and just keep every day going back to, so what am I doing today? Does it have an impact on the longer term while also managing the shorter term? And very, very helpful.
I use the business canvas a lot, or I use the business canvas a lot with my teams, and I'm in the process of trying to figure out how to do some skills videos and shorter segments and introducing that. I think that's the next step. I finally did my Sam Pam type of video, or it's just in the works. It's going to get recorded this week, and that my next challenge is taking the business canvas and trying to figure out. It's a series of videos, trying to figure out what that series looks like. I'm building the resources for it and they're almost done. And it's now, how do I split it up? And maybe that's something we can do in the future, is come back and talk a
Yep,
little bit about the use
we
of the
could.
business canvas as another podcast.
But going, if I can just jump on the SAM and TAM, so many applicants to government funding think you're impressing me or the review panel with, it's $1 billion market. We've got it. Of the stack of all the applicants, our eyes would just roll back in our head and we just dismiss those numbers. Means nothing. The one that is important is the, who have I actually talking to today that I'm engaged with and I'm about to either close a demo or a sale. Those are the ones that now I'm actually going to read it, but I can just tell you from experiences, you can throw billion, 10 billion, $100 billion. They're not even reading it. I can tell you that.
I found actually in a lot of my case teams, they went through the exercise because it's a helpful exercise just to learn what the market looks like. But often it wasn't something that wound up in the final presentation. It was more of those, what do we have on the ground type of pieces, or
Exactly.
what should you be looking for in terms of the on the ground pieces with that. We've provided, there's a lot of information to go through there when people are listening, but just in terms of advice, so students, early stage entrepreneurs, what's the advice that you would throw out to them?
Yeah. If they're serious of looking at being part of a company or growing, the biggest gap that I see right now is students hang out with students and they do their pitches on campus, but they don't actually get out into the market. So my biggest advice is getting to events like Platform Calgary. There's all kinds of events and it's, you don't need to be pitching there. So you could go to a publicly open pitch contest just to listen, and guess who's in the audience? It's guys like myself who are funders, government agents, others that are there, even semi-retired, retired folk who are eager to share knowledge, give back, and are network like crazy. Because between the two of us, if a student wanted to network, let's say in health innovation, chances are between the two of us, we're going to be able to get them in to some very meaningful discussions with meaningful the right people versus phoning 1-800 hospital saying who can I talk to. It's not going to happen. You're not going to get the answer. But if you and I are that conduit, and the thing that over and over and over I would see is we're so hungry to give back and to support that next generation. You just need to bump into each other, whether it's at a conference, and many students can get in free at these conferences that you and I have to pay a lot for just because they want to mentor. So whether it's hydrogen, CCUS, oil and gas platform with their conferences, and they're having them weekly. You could look it up on their schedules, and even in remote areas, the regional innovation networks are always putting on events where even if you're not pitching, guess who's sitting next to you? So go with your business cards, your LinkedIn, whatever, and just don't be afraid to press some flesh, as they say, and shake some hands and get known because there's so many people like you and I eager to help and very well connected will make it worth their while.
That can't be said any better. I think one of the things, and it always annoys me when I do advising at things like how to change the world, the heat thing at Cascade. They've got these great ideas, and contact me, and I can put you in contact with someone that can really help you. I think on one of the sessions they were talking about a device that helped people drag their skis with all their kids' skis and that across the parking lot. And I offered up, I know someone that owns a ski resort, right? And a major ski resort in this country. And nothing. There was no return email, no LinkedIn message, etc. And I just like, so sad. I want to finish this off just with a bit of a story. I was in Rotterdam one year with the team, and I think we had just finished the opening ceremonies. So we're sitting by the Erasmus Bridge on the Mass River and just talking about different things. And one of the questions that came up was, why were they there? And the interesting piece was no one talked about the case competition whatsoever. It was about the ability to network with students from foreign countries, the ability to network with the judges that were actually coming really spread across Europe, etc. And I thought, yeah, you know what? I got 4 students that get it, right? This is what it's about. And those 4 have gone on to be incredibly successful in terms of what they're doing nowadays. So thank you.
Mhm.
And
With
great pleasure to have you. And